I'm delighted to be joined now by former advisor to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, Patrick Diamond. Patrick, lovely to see you.
Great to be
here. Thanks for coming in on Father's Day.
I know, but it's very good to be with you.
Thank you very much. So, first of all, your reaction to the Labour manifesto announced in Manchester to great fanfare on Thursday, what do you think?
It was a very slick launch of Labour's manifesto. I think given that their campaign is based around a message of stability and competence, they can't be disappointed with the launch of that manifesto. It was a great success from a political point of view.
Starmer himself said, look, I'm not pulling any rabbits out of the hat. You know, if you want gimmicks, go and look at other parties, which left some thinking it was a bit underwhelming. You know, there wasn't much in it that we didn't know that they were already going to announce. Then they say about this idea of not raising taxes for individuals. So they're saying no taxes on working people. So no increase to VAT, no increase to income tax and no increase to national insurance. And yet pull through the documents and there's £8.6 billion worth of hidden taxes on non-DOMs, people with overseas properties, people who pay private school fees, for instance. I mean, is it smoke and mirrors?
Well, I think it's trying to offer the best assessment they can of where the country is on tax and spend. They're not in government yet. It is true that there is a lot of pressure to raise taxes, and we've seen reports today about the NHS. When you look at the funding situation facing the National Health Service, it does look like whoever's in government next is going to have to seriously look at the long-term funding mechanism. But election campaigns are like this. We have a debate about tax and spend, which, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies have pointed out, isn't as candid as it could be about the choices facing the country.
Yeah, as in people are being told that they're not going to be taxed more, but if both sides, whoever wins, keep those tax thresholds frozen, the tax burden goes up whatever happens.
Exactly, and I think one of the phony aspects of the debate in the election so far has been people are not focusing on the fact that there's already substantial tax rises baked in, whoever's in power, in the existing Tory proposals. So that means that taxes will rise whatever happens on July the 4th.
What's your reaction to some of the concerns, and maybe they're only being expressed on the right, but the idea of Keir Starmer winning a supermajority, a much bigger majority than Tony Blair's, but comparatively on a much smaller vote share? I think the YouGov poll that put Reform ahead of the Tories, that so-called crossover moment, had Labour's vote share down to 37%. And I personally think, you know, if you're getting below 40% and you've got a massive majority, something doesn't seem quite right there. There could be criticisms that you don't have the mandate. I appreciate how democracy works, by the way, and I appreciate first past the post. Is that a legitimate complaint? Because Tony Blair won his landslide in 97 on the basis of 43% of the popular vote. I think in this case, if the number begins with a 3, it's not quite the same proposition, is it?
Well, I mean, people will look at the share of the vote, but in a first-past-the-post system, obviously what matters is what is happening in individual constituencies. And because of the way the system works, it does mean that you can win a very substantial majority on a somewhat lower share of the vote than the one that Tony Blair got in 1997. I mean, it is interesting there's a lot of discussion about what does Labour do about the problem of a supermajority.
Yeah.
If you're a supporter of the Labour Party, you're thinking to yourself, that would be a very nice problem to have.
I mean,
because Labour has not had many supermajorities in its history.
Let's discuss that, because obviously you've been close to previous Labour leaders, Blair and Brown. Is that a problem? If he's got, say, over 250 majority, for instance, and he's managing huge amounts of different types of Labour MPs, the young, the older, the experienced, the inexperienced, maybe the more Corbynista and the more moderate. Is that problematic for him, do you reckon? Especially as he didn't expect to be Prime Minister, let's be honest.
I think initially the enthusiasm, the wave of unity across the Labour Party at having won the election, if that's what happens on July the 4th, and I think there's still an if, we can't assume anything, we can't assume any outcome about this election, but if that happens, then initially there'll be a mood of unity. But of course, as time goes on and they have to make difficult decisions about policy, there is scope for disagreement. The way that we tend to look at this is a left-right split, so we think, are there left-wing MPs in the Parliamentary Labour Party who will cause difficulty for Keir Starmer? That could be a factor, but I think there's other policies that could lead to other divisions. For example, housing. If you have lots of Labour MPs elected for suburban constituencies in which there is going to be substantial new development of housing, will that lead to divisions about how far you can go on development and new towns and so on? So I think we could see divisions, but not necessarily of the traditional left-right kind.
Starmer as an individual, I mean, I just said there he didn't expect to be Prime Minister, just to put that into context, because obviously he won the leadership, Boris Johnson had won an 80-seat majority. It looked like he was going to be in play for at least 5 to 10 years. I suppose Starmer then thinks he might be this Neil Kinnock sort of holding pattern candidate until somebody else rises through the ranks who might have a bit more charisma and personality. I don't want to be nasty to the Labour leader, but there is the sense to which he is quite robotic and bland, and we've maybe witnessed that in recent TV debates. He's not Blair, is he? And is that a problem?
He's a different type of politician, but I think politicians make sense in the political context that they're working in.
Yeah.
And today what people want from their leaders is not perhaps a lot of spin and showmanship, but solid, consistent, reliable leadership. And I think that is what Keir Starmer is offering. I think you're quite right, though, to talk about the shift that's taken place. It is remarkable. 5 years ago, Labour looked completely out of the picture.
Yeah.
It was going to take years to recover. In 2021 even, only 3 years ago, the Conservatives won that dramatic by-election victory in Hartlepool. There was an opinion poll last week which showed the Conservatives in Hartlepool on 10% of the vote. Now, we'll see what happens, but it just underlines, I think, the shift has been amazing. And lots of people could come on your programme and say, we predicted this, we knew this was going to happen. The truth is, not many people 3 years ago really thought that Labour was within a shot of winning this election. So the shift in the underlying politics of Britain has been remarkable. And when I say Britain, I think obviously that's partly about what's been happening down here in Westminster, but also Scotland.
Yes.
One of the reasons why Labour's set to do so well on July the 4th, potentially, is because Scotland's politics have completely transformed since the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon.
Yeah, and also I suppose people fed up with how long the SNP have been in power there, in a similar way to people being fed up with 14 years of Tory rule.
And that is extraordinary. You have that sense both in Westminster and in Holyrood that it's time for a change, whether it's the SNP in Scotland or the Conservatives governing the whole of the UK. There is that mood of, we're just fed up, we want something different.
And hence why his sloganeering, Keir Starmer particularly, it's just that one word, change, which I noted in Manchester. Can I talk to you about constitutional matters? Because you've got some skin in the game here. The historian David Starkey, and indeed it was followed up by Peter Hitchens in the Mail in the week, have expressed concern that Starmer has endorsed this paper and then seemed to have echoed it in his manifesto, this idea of taking more power away from MPs and elected representatives and putting it in the hands of the Supreme Court and then quangos, arm's-length bodies that aren't as accountable to the public as, say, elected representatives. And he's saying, Starkey and indeed Hitchens is saying this is a continuation of Brown and Blairism, the idea of taking power away from those who are in Parliament to others, and that's going to continue. And if the Constitution isn't adequately protected, it's going to consign conservatism to the scrap heap for 10 years. Can you react to that? Is that legitimate concern and complaint?
I think you've got to look at the particular areas of policy where that's happened. So with central bank independence, which is, of course, the big decision that Gordon Brown took in 1997, I think setting interest rates through a group of experts rather than having them politically manipulated has been, on balance, the right decision. If you had interest rates now in the hands of politicians, if we'd had in 2022 Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng operating interest rate levers as well as everything else, the consequences for the economy could have been very serious.
Okay.
So I'm not sure that the objection applies across the board. But I think there is a legitimate point about how widely spread is power in Britain and also what are the safeguards in place, particularly if you were to have a government in the future that did have a very large majority. How do we make sure that the voice of those who perhaps don't support that government or come from other parts of the UK is properly represented? I should just say Labour is, of course, committed also to devolution. And I think one of the good things about both of the Conservative and Labour manifestos is that there's some continuity. In the past, a new government comes in and rips up everything that the previous government has done. In this case, Labour is proposing to stick with devolved city region mayors that the Conservatives introduced early in the 2010s. I think that's a good thing for our democracy. It means that there's some stability and continuity rather than the constant chopping and changing.
Really, really briefly, we've only got a minute left. When Rachel Reeves talks about not putting up taxes, not wanting to borrow outside of strict fiscal rules and not wanting a return to austerity, how are they going to get the money to spend anything on anything?
Well, what they're going to hope for is growth. There is a big growth strategy in that manifesto, but of course, with geopolitical events, changes going on in the world economy, whether we'll get growth that quickly remains a very open question.
Although things may improve for them, at least in the first year.
There are some indications of that.
Comes down and things like that.
Absolutely.
Patrick Diamond, thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning. Great to have your expertise on this issue.